In the preceding module, we saw that when a market is in equilibrium, there is no tendency for the price or quantity to change. But we also know from chapters 4 and 5 that the demand curve and the supply curve can shift. These shifts cause the equilibrium price and quantity in the market to change. For example, many teenagers like to wear the latest fashions. The popularity of particular types of clothing, whether soccer jerseys, leggings, board shorts, boots, change from year to year. These and similar changes in tastes affect the demand for trendy goods and services. When an article of clothing becomes fashionable, the demand curve for that article shifts to the right. The excess demand causes the price to rise, and suppliers respond by increasing the quantity supplied. Similarly, changes in technology and disruptions in transportation cause the supply curves for some goods to shift. In the chapter opening story, for example, we saw that the eruption of the Icelandic volcano in 2010 disrupted the supply of salmon to Asia. Thus, in the Asian market for salmon, the supply curve shifted to the left, the price rose, and buyers responded by decreasing the quantity demanded. Some of the most important questions you will encounter in economics involve predicting how a shift of the supply curve or demand curve will affect a market. In this module, we consider what happens to price and quantity when the supply curve shifts, when the demand curve shifts, and when both curves shift at the same time. Our first step in exploring these changes is to recall the different types of events that can change supply or demand, and thus shift the supply or demand curve. So, a change in supply or demand, as shown by a shift of the supply or demand curve, causes the equilibrium price and quantity to change in a predictable way. That's the key idea for this module. So, with that in mind, I will first explain how a change in supply affects the equilibrium price and quantity. Then I will explain how a change in demand affects the equilibrium price and quantity. And finally, I will explain what is known and what is unknown about the effect of a simultaneous change in both supply and demand. So, here we recall the different types of events that can change supply or demand and thus shift the supply curve to the right or to the left. You may wish to pause the video right now and copy this chart down into your notes and study it for a little while to make sure that you're familiar with the demand curve shifters and the supply curve shifters that we looked at in previous modules, because they will come into play again here in this module and you'll need to know them again. When demand changes, the price consumers pay and the quantity purchased change as well. So next, we'll examine the reasons for these potentially important changes in equilibrium price and quantity. First, let's consider the market for spinach. Some people really like to eat spinach, but it takes a back seat to potatoes, lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, and even celery in terms of its popularity. But suppose new research reveals unexpected health benefits from eating spinach. News of these benefits would increase people's preference for spinach. What would happen to the price and the quantity of spinach? To answer this question, let's first consider the equilibrium in the spinach market before the new research is announced. If you look at the figure in front of us, it shows the market supply and demand curves for spinach. The initial equilibrium is indicated by point E1, which is right here. And that's determined by the intersection of the original demand curve, which is D1, and the original supply curve, which is S1. Now, you may have noticed something different about this graph. There are no numbers along the axes. Remember that rather than being labeled with specific numbers, the equilibrium price is labeled P1 on the y-axis, and the equilibrium quantity is labeled Q1 on the x-axis. It is often useful to illustrate a market with a generic supply and demand graph like this, which does not indicate actual numbers for prices or quantities. The generic graph is just a simplified version of the supply and demand graphs we've been discussing. Generic graphs make it easy to see how equilibrium is determined and how it changes after a shift. In the generic graph, P stands for price, and the number 1 indicates that P1, again right here, is our first or initial equilibrium price before the shift in demand. Similarly, Q stands for quantity, and Q1, again, is our initial equilibrium quantity. Now, let's consider the effect of the new research finding on the spinach market. Knowing that spinach is especially healthy, at any given price, consumers will demand more spinach than before. This change in tastes causes an increase in demand, represented by a rightward shift of the demand curve from D1 to D2. Now, when the demand curve shifts to the right, the price will not stay at P1. After the shift, the quantity of spinach demanded at the old price of P1, right here, this quantity right here, is greater than the quantity that would be supplied at that particular price, which would be right here. Let me see. Let me get that right for you so you can see that correctly. The quantity, after the shift, the quantity of spinach demanded at the old price, if you look at P1, quantity demanded will be right here at this point. Whoops. Let me see if I can get my pen to work. Right there. That point right there is the point that would be demanded at that price. But how much is going to be supplied at that price? It's right here. So there won't be enough supplied, okay? And that's the problem. And we call this excess demand for spinach. And some buyers cannot get the spinach they desire. So because of that, the price rises to take care of the excess demand. The price will go up, as we can see right here. In fact, the price will keep rising until the quantities supplied and demanded are equal again. This occurs at the new equilibrium point, which is E2, right here. And that's where the new demand curve, D2, this demand curve, intersects the original supply curve, which has not shifted. Okay. Now, at the new equilibrium price of P2, right here, the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are both equal now to Q2, the new equilibrium quantity of spinach. Because supply and demand are back in balance, there will be no tendency for the price to rise or fall. Note what has happened to the price and quantity. Because of the change in taste and the resulting increase in demand, the new equilibrium price and quantity at E2, right here, are both higher than the initial equilibrium price and quantity at E1. This example illustrates an important result. If the market supply remains unchanged, that is, if the supply curve does not shift, anything that causes the demand curve to shift to the right will cause the price and quantity to increase. Let's consider an alternative story. Suppose that instead of finding new health benefits, research indicates that eating too much spinach will turn your skin green. Once consumers become aware of this, their interest in spinach will wilt. They will demand less spinach at each price, as illustrated by a leftward shift of the demand curve. So now we're going to see what happens with a decrease in demand. This figure illustrates what happens in this case. As before, the initial equilibrium point is at point E1, right here. And that's determined by the intersection of the original demand curve, D1, right there, and the original supply curve, which is S1, right here. The initial equilibrium price then is P1, and the initial equilibrium quantity is Q1. The new revelation about spinach causes the demand curve now to shift to the left. And now we label that demand curve 2. But notice what happens. There is excess supply at the initial price. At the initial price, the amount supplied is right here, but the amount demanded at that price will be over here. And so we have a difference, and that is too much supply. So because of this excess supply at the initial price, that's going to lead to a price decrease to get rid of the excess supply, and the new equilibrium will now be at E2, where the new demand curve, D2, intersects the original supply curve, right here. At the new equilibrium price of P2, this point right here, The quantity supplied and the quantity demand are both equal now to Q2, which is the new equilibrium quantity of spinach. As a result of the decrease in demand, the new equilibrium price and quantity are lower than the initial price and quantity. This example illustrates another important result. If market supply remains unchanged, any factor that causes the demand curve to shift to the left will cause the price and quantity to fall.